parable of the lost son. Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, sailed for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was severe famine in that cold country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to the fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired men have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to call your sons. Make me like one of your hired men. So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way, his father saw him and filled with he runs to his son, threw his arms around him. The son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven, against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called son. But the father said to the servant, quick, get bread and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. That's what the priest can celebrate. For the son of mine is dead and is alive again. He was lost and he is found. So they celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, look, after all these years, I've been slaving to you and never disobeyed your orders. You never came to me, but you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friend. In front of yours, who has squandered your property, prostitutes come to you. You killed the fattened calf for him. My son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we have to celebrate and be glad, because the father of yours was dead and is alive again. And it's found.
Well, today is the midpoint of our short series looking at some of the parables that Jesus taught. And today's one's a really well-known one. It's possibly the most famous of the lot, perhaps maybe only after last week's Good Samaritan as far as how well people know this one. And I say that because it's one that even people who don't wouldn't even read the Bible or go to church, they're probably familiar with it. This one is so well known that the name of it is often referred to in TV shows and movies because most people are aware of it. They get it when they hear this name. It's often called the prodigal son. And it's one that has a couple of messages that we're to take from this parable. There are 2 big points that come out of it, and it speaks about 2 very different attitudes that people can have towards God. So firstly, there's the message for what is the non-Christian about the way God accepts those who repented their sin and how they can come back to him no matter how far lost they may have been. Whatever sin they may have committed, whatever problems they've got in their life, God forgives those who ask him for acceptance. But there's also a second message for the person who says that they already know God and how they are to welcome in those who have repented, how they need to accept those who are new to the church, having come back from the world, and not see their place before God as being something that they themselves have earned. That they too are owning a relationship with God due to his grace and not because of their own greatness. And it's the second point that is often overlooked, But there is this message being made here in this parable, because there are two people in the passage who both have the wrong attitudes, but they show it in very different ways. But through the story of both of these sons, we get a better understanding of God's love and his tolerance to those who have walked away from him and rejected him, and how we all need to actually come back to him and see our own fault and realize all that we've got, it comes from him and only him. Which means this parable is really talking to everyone. People who have come into the church from non-Christian families, who have found themselves repenting of their sins after years of living in the world and going their own way, as well as for people who have grown up in the church and they've always been in the family as such, having never been on the outside, never been like those who didn't know God beforehand, but of course still needing to remember that no one is simply born into salvation, but we're all here for what is the same reason, because we have been saved through Jesus. We all come before God on the same grounds, irrespective of what was our journey getting here. So all of us can actually learn from this particular parable, as it deals with some of the wrong attitudes that any of us could have, and could therefore stop us from asking for God's grace, as we're either taking it for granted or we're outright rejecting it. We're either just thinking that we don't need God, or we're thinking that we're already good enough. We've already earned our salvation some way. Because the main message coming from this is that God's grace is there, and it is there for all people, irrespective of what their attitude was before they came to realize how incredible that grace is. Right? Even if I haven't realized at that point, the offer is there, and now it's saying you've got to come to realize just what it is that God has given you. Either you have been brought back into the family, or you're only in the family because of God's grace in the first place. So going straight into the passage now, there's a bit to unpack here, right? We see that there are three people, and the story is going to evolve around these three. Firstly, there is a father who is quite wealthy, but also very generous with that wealth. And then there are two sons, two very different children who behave very differently, and they treat their father very differently. And each of these people is going to represent someone, and that is where we'll get the message from. Look at who the father is and who the sons represent. So let's look at each of the sons, starting with the youngest, the prodigal is referred to, and we'll see what the attitude of these children is, and then we'll better understand what that shows us about the different ways in which people can see God and how God's grace can overcome their wrong attitude to begin with. So to start with this younger one, we see that the younger one is completely selfish, right? We see that he's reckless, we see that he's foolish, and he doesn't want to be in the family, right? He wants to leave. That's the main problem here. Hence why he gets called the prodigal son. Prodigal basically means a reckless spender, right? They waste their wealth on what is foolish extravagance. Hence why we see that not only does he want to leave the family, he wants a big payout first so he can go live the good life, right? He wants his dad's wealth so he can run away and do his own thing. So we read here in verse 12, it says, the younger son said to the father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So we see here, he wants his inheritance now. All right, he knows he will be owed a part of the family fortune one day. Right? If he waits long enough, one day he'll inherit his part of the family fortune. But he doesn't want to wait till that day. He wants it now so he can spend it right now. And we see that is exactly what happens. The passage continues on to say, so he divided, this is the father, so he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all that he had, set off for a distant country, and there he squandered his wealth in wild living. So we see a couple of things come out of just those three short sentences there. That one, this son wants the family money so he can run off and live life as he sees fit. but that he can't wait for his father to die in order to inherit the money. He isn't going to wait to get what would be left for him one day. He just wants his cut right now, as he's just got no self-control. Because that's what this means. Normally the father leaves money in the will, but the son here is essentially saying, give it to me now, right? I want it now so I can run off and spend it, and I can't wait for you to die in order to get it. I need it right this moment. So we get a clear view of this son, how he sees his father. And we see that there's no love there, right? There's no gratitude for all that the father's provided him in his life. There's just this entitled attitude of getting what he wants. He does not care for his father, despite all that the father's given him. He just wants his father's wealth, and he wants nothing to do with him. He wants to take the money and run. Which leads to the second point, and that is that the father gives it to him. He gives him the inheritance. He does what his son asks. The father doesn't tell him to get lost. He gives him what he wants. So the son leaves with this money. So there's a very lopsided relationship going on here. The father shows respect to his son. He shows him incredible generosity. But the son only cares about getting what he can off the father and then forgetting about him. Right? He just wants out the family once he gets the family's estate. That's his priority. But then as we move on, we see where this attitude gets him. Right? What all this greed and this recklessness results in for him. Because we see that he squanders everything very quickly. He wastes it all. And then he's got nothing. And his situation becomes very bad. Right? Because he goes on to say this. He goes on to say in verse 14, after he'd spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to the fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. So that's how bad things get for him. He spends all the money to a point that he can't even feed himself. So now he has to work. And he's got to work feeding pigs in a distant country. Obviously not Israel, because here he is serving on a pig farm. But there, even the animals, the pigs, are better off than he is. Right? They're better fed than he is. In fact, it even says, he longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating. So he's now so desperate that he's desiring pig food. Right? He'll eat absolutely everything, even the garbage that a pig would eat. And being in such a situation, this is what wakes him up, right? He realizes what a terrible mistake he's made. His father's rich. He was well off. He was given everything. You know, he's lived a pretty privileged life. And this desire to go on his own and cut his father off, it's made him hit rock bottom. He's now lost everything. So this is what we now see it say in verse 17. After he's lost everything, after everything's just gone absolutely pear-shaped, it's all fallen apart, he now realizes the mistake he's made and what he's got to do about it. Right? Now he's going to wake up to himself. Because it says here in 17, when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I'll set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and went to his father. So we see that after all this, he comes running back to the father. He realizes what a foolish and selfish person he has been, and that he needs his father. And now he'll have to admit to all that he has done wrong. And he'll have to relinquish his rights as a child. Right? That's what it means by, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. He says this as he doesn't think he'll be sitting at the family dinner table anymore. But at least, even if he's not going to have the rights of a son, he's lost all that, at least he'll be well fed. He'll be fed along with the other servants in the room next door. He's still better off than what he is, longing for pig food. So even if he's lost his privilege as a son, this is the better option. It's better than where he is now. Now, what is amazing here is that when he gets there, when he gets back home, his father welcomes him, right? His father doesn't say, get lost, you had your chance. He doesn't say, okay, all right, I'll let you back in, but you're going to have to work off all that I gave you. You wasted all that money I gave you. Now I want it back. You're going to have to earn it all back. I'm not giving you anything else. Instead, we see that he forgives him. It says in verse 20, but whilst he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. So we see that the father's only concerned about having his son back, right? That's his priority. His son has woken up to himself and returned home, and the father is so happy about that. And in fact, we get the impression that the father has been waiting there, looking for the day that the son comes back, that this is the moment that he has been hoping for. He hasn't given up hope that his son would come back one day. Hence why before the son even gets to the house, it's not like the son walked up and knocked on the door and said, Father, I'm home. Before he even gets home, the father sees him in the distance, and the father runs out to him. He runs out to embrace him. And we see in the next verse, when the father gets to him, the son says the line, right? He says how he's sorry, that he's not worthy to be his son. But the father just seems to ignore all this. He ignores all the, I'm not worthy to be your son apologies. Because the next verse says, the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. So the father's not angry. He's happy. He's overjoyed. He forgives his son and welcomes him home, and the son is safe again and a part of the family. Right? The father is not making the son pay off his debt. He will not hold this against him. The son being sorry and coming home, that's all that matters. That's the main thing from the father's point of view. That's all the father wants, for his son to come back to him and be in the family once more. Now there is the main story of the parable, right? That's the story, the main part of it. This prodigal son realizing what a fool he's been and then coming home to the father and the father accepting him back. But the question then is, well, what is the point of this? Because remember, this is a parable, right? It tells us something. It's not about a reckless kid who had a forgiving father, right? That's not the main point. The son represents someone, and the father represents someone, and we've got to figure it out. Like all parables, we've got to figure out what is this all about. So the question is, who is the son? And the answer simply is, it's us. It's people who have gone their own way, right? People who have rejected God. People who have rejected God in our selfishness and in our sin. We've said, I want to live my own life. But then, like the son in the story, it all falls apart, right? We realize what a mistake we've made. We end up hurt and broken because we need God, and we realize we can't do it ourselves. We realize this is why the world is such a mess, because people have gone their own way. They've tried to do it their way and not God's way. They've walked away from God, and then they realize that the sin in their life is what ruins everything. And then they say, like the son here, they say, I have sinned against heaven and against you. And it's only when we come to see the damage that the sin does in our life do we then see the need to turn back to God and ask for forgiveness. So that's what this youngest son is all about. The youngest son represents those, like us, who had once walked away from God, and then we've come back. We've come back when we've become convicted of our sin, and when we've realized that life without God is no life at all. That we can't do it on our own, that everything we do just becomes a mess, and then we need to come back to God and say, God, fix this. Forgive us for what we've done wrong. We are sorry for our sin. But that then means the next question is, well, who's the father? Okay? Who does the father represent in the story? We know who the son represents. It's us. It's sinners. who have realized that we're in sin and we need forgiveness. So who does the Father represent? And that's pretty easy to figure out. It's God, right? It's God. God is the one who gives us everything and the one who forgives us when we wrong him, when we have run away. And as we see here, like the Father, he welcomes us back. He brings us back into the family. We didn't want him, but when we came back asking for forgiveness, he doesn't tell us to get lost. Instead, he forgives us and he welcomes us home. And he doesn't get us to pay back our debt, which is the other important thing here. The son didn't have to buy his way back into the family. He didn't have to pay off all that money he wasted. Instead, what we see is that the debt is wiped. The Father takes the loss on himself. And that is just like how God takes a debt, our debt, on himself. And for the Son here, the Father's forgiveness results in what is a feast, a celebration. And that is exactly how heaven is described. It's described as a feast, a celebration for those who are lost and are now saved. So just as the Father describes the Son here in the last verse by saying that he was dead and is alive again, he was lost and is found, well, this is also talking about anyone who once rejected God and has now come back to him. Anyone who was lost in their sin and has been restored to God. So that's what this first son is all about. He represents those who have rejected God, and when we realize the mistake that we've made, well, like the Father here, God welcomes us home. The parable is it's an image that we can picture of what it means to be loved and welcomed by God, having lived our life in sin. Right? Despite our sin, this is what it looks like to be forgiven by God and to have our debt erased. If you could picture just how incredible, loving and forgiving this Father is to accept this horrible son home, to accept him back and say, you are my son and I love you and I'm so happy you're here, your debt is forgotten. If you can picture that, then that is what it looks like for any of us to come back to the Father and for the God to say, your sin is forgiven, welcome back. Let's have a feast, let's have a festival to welcome you back into the family. Now that's the first son. But of course, what about the other son? Right? There are two here. That's what I said before. There are two sons here. There are two things going on in this parable. And it is very important to look at both, as he often gets overlooked. Right? It is called the prodigal son after all. So most people only focus on that son, the younger one, the one who ran off and wasted everything. That becomes the main point of the story. But what about the son who stayed the whole time? Because his story is nearly half the passage. So he also represents something. He's got an important part to play in this. There's a reason why the passage talks about him, because he's also telling us something about the kind of attitude we should or shouldn't have when it comes to living for God. So what we see here is that on the surface at least, the second son is a good one. That unlike the younger brother, he stays with the Father. He doesn't run off. He does the right thing. And he does what the younger son should have done from the beginning. And because of this, we see that it creates an attitude problem with the older son. We see that there is jealousy and anger. And it certainly comes out when this younger son wakes up to himself and comes home and is forgiven by his father. So we see that when the younger son gets back to the home, gets back to the father, it says in 25, meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. And this is what the servant says to him. When the older son's going, what's happening here? The servant says, your brother has come, he replied. And your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. Now, this should be a time for celebration. His lost younger brother has woke up to himself and returned home. This is something good. And this is why everyone is happy, especially the father. And we see that they're all celebrating, they're all happy except for one person. And it's this other son, right? And we see that it causes rage in this older good son. It says in verse 28, the older brother became angry and refused to go in. And then it says, so his father went out and pleaded with him. So he's having a totally different reaction to everyone else. And he explains what the issue is in verse 29. He tells his father why he's so angry and why he finds this all completely unfair. It's not right that everyone's so happy that the bad son has come home. Because he says to him, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you killed a fattened calf for him. So he doesn't want the brother forgiven. And he believes that he's been ripped off, that he hasn't been rewarded for his loyalty. Right? He's saying to his father, I have always been good. He's done the wrong thing. And yet you welcome him back. You give him the feast. So he doesn't want the brother forgiven. He wants his dad to be angry as well. He wants everyone to hate the younger brother as much as he does. He doesn't even call him his brother. He says, this son of yours. He wants nothing to do with him, and he's furious at the father and everyone else for wanting something to do with this guy after all that he did. Which is why the father reassures this older son that he's not missed out. He's not being ripped off in any way. It's not like that. They can be happy that the brother is back. And it doesn't mean that this son, this older brother, is now worse off. Right? He doesn't lose from the other brother being found and welcomed home. So the father says this to him. He's trying to reassure him here. He says to him, my son, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So what is this all about? Right? Why does the second half of the parable now focus on this son and this anger towards his brother? The first one was about repentance, understanding where someone had gone wrong and the father forgiven him. But now we see it's looking at this other son and his attitude. So why is this now the focus of the parable? What is this talking about? Well, we've got to remember who Jesus is talking to here. Right? When we look at the start of the chapter, which is a bit before our passage that we read out, but when we look at verse 1, this is what we read. It says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathered around to hear Jesus. So these are the people who, like the prodigal son, they are the ones who have messed up their life, right? Tax collectors, sinners. This is about people who are far from God, okay? These are the ones who have gone out and they're living in the world. But then in the next verse, in verse 2, it then says this. It says that there are other people there. It says, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. So here you have what are the religious people. People who are supposedly good people. The people who follow God's laws. The ones that others look up to as go, oh, these are the people right with God. Because these are the people who supposedly haven't messed up their life. The ones who haven't run off and fallen into sin, like the tax collectors. The ones who have stayed with God the entire time, supposedly. So now Jesus is talking about them. Because they are the older son. Because look at their attitude towards the tax collectors and those who have come to Jesus to hear this gospel. They see all these people coming to Jesus. And they say about Jesus, this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. So for them, seeing these tax collectors and sinners hanging around with Jesus, there's no joy for them. There's no joy in seeing people repent and come back to God. They're not like, wow, isn't this great that these people have come back to find God, that they're repenting of their sin, that they realize that they're sinners and doing the wrong thing and now looking to fix that. No, their attitude is that Jesus shouldn't even be talking to these people. Their attitude is they're sinners, they're bad people, they've gone off, and they don't deserve God. So that means they've got the same attitude as this older son. They've got the same self-righteous attitude that only they are good enough, so only they deserve that the rewards that God gives. They act like they've earned God's favor, that they've been good enough to be in God's family. They're accepted in God's family because of how good they are. So the point of this older son is to show how he took all that his father had been given him for granted. It's to actually show that even though he's supposedly the good son, he's not like the prodigal son, how he's actually as ungrateful as the younger brother, but is just showing it in a different way. So that's why he says, look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. And then after that, he then complains, yet you never gave me a young goat so that I could celebrate with my friends. See, his whole attitude is that his father has done nothing good for him. And that all that he has done, it's not been out of love for his father, but with reluctance. That's why he says, I've been slaving for you. So this is why he's actually just as bad as the younger son, and he doesn't realize it. The younger son was selfish and then came to realize it. The older son is selfish. He just hasn't woken up to that yet. Instead, he thinks he's perfect. And he thinks that he has earned everything and he's actually owed even more. Everything should go to him because of what a good son he has been. Which is what these religious leaders were like. That was always the big problem throughout the Gospels. They believed that they were good enough and that God owed them and that no one else should be saved. They've done all the right stuff, and now God should reward them for just how good they've been. So this is really like Christians today who see themselves as better than others, and they don't want others to come to Christ. They don't want these other people to get forgiveness. They've come to church maybe their entire life. They've always called themselves Christians. And then new people come in who have been rejecting God, who have been living out in the world, who have come to see their sin. So these people then say, well, why should they get to come in? Why do they get the same inheritance? Why do they get a taste of heaven from God just as I do, who has actually done more for it? I've always done the right thing by God. I wasn't out there living in sin. Or maybe even worse still, maybe they have a friend, right, that they don't like anymore. They've got a family member who hurt them. So they don't want them to be forgiven by God. So they hide the gospel from them. They don't want them to have forgiveness. They want all the inheritance for themselves. They don't want other people to be coming into the kingdom. They want to say, those people are bad. I don't want them to know salvation in Christ. I want it all for me. So that's what's really coming out here. The whole point of this other son in the parables is to show that he had an attitude, whilst different to the younger son, that was actually just as bad. There were other problems going on here. This son, whilst obedient, he did the right thing, but the problem was it caused so much self-righteousness. He talks about how good he is and why he should be given more, why his younger brother shouldn't get anything, and why he shouldn't be accepted back after all the wrong that he has done. And the father's saying to him, he's trying to wake him up. The younger son's woken up, now he's trying to wake the older son up, and he's saying, but you already had everything. You already had it all. You're not losing because he's gaining. Again, as he says at the end, he says, my son, you're always with me and everything I have is yours, but we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. The Father's trying to get across to him. He's saying, you're not missing out just because I've forgiven your brother. Instead, you should be happy that he's come back. You should be happy that he's woken up to himself and is again a part of the family. Come and celebrate with the rest of us. This is really good news. This is an awesome thing. And hence why we today should be likewise doing the same kind of happiness, having the same happiness when we see others repenting and coming back to God. We should be happy when others come into church. We're to be happy that these people have come back to God and that they're now going to go to heaven with us. They're going to have a part of this same inheritance. We shouldn't be saying, hey, I've gone to church my whole life. And then this person just shows up and they get to go to heaven as well. They get the same treatment I do. That's not fair. Instead, we shouldn't be seeing heaven and the inheritance as something that we've earned. It's not like that. We should be happy that these people have rejoined the family and they've been given the same grace by our Father that we've got. That they've woken up to themselves and they've come back to God and they're now going to be given the same gifts that we have been fortunate enough to receive from God as well. So the main point of all this is to know that the Father is God and his forgiveness is for everyone. It's even those who run away from him because they can come back. It's not too late. And for those of us who know God, well, we should welcome those people back. We should be out there telling them, hey, please come home. God's grace is for you. We shouldn't be angry like this older brother, but happy that these people have joined us, that they have now realized their sin and they've come back to the Father as well. So let me read that final line again. It really helps us to understand how we should act, what our attitude should be like. It says, we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and he's alive again. He was lost and he's found. And that's the attitude we're to have. God welcomes all those who come back to him, so we should do that as well. So that means let's make sure that we tell others the gospel message so they can come back to God. And when we tell them the gospel and they do repent, when they wake up to themselves, welcome them back into the church community. Let them know that they need God and then rejoice if they repent that they have found God and that they are no longer lost. They're no longer lost to the world, that they have now come back to knowing the grace of God just as we do.